All right, this is what I wanted to do is I want to take a few minutes today and kind of supplement some of the things that are already posted. So the other classes had an exam that actually they took last week. And just to give you an idea, the worst class had like a 54 average on the in-class part of the test. The best class was maybe about 8 or 10 points higher, so they were in the low to mid 60s. So I wouldn't say that this is easy. I would say that it's very, very doable, but the exam grade is going to be the combination of the in-class with the take-home reading quiz. And whether you're in the night class or you're in the 2 o'clock class, y'all all have the access to the reading quiz. Take a look at some of those sample questions before you take the exam. Please take a look at them at least once just so that you get an idea, because the questions are a little different than maybe what you're accustomed to. Second thing, as you go through this, make sure that you're really, really good with the articles. And we'll cover some things today. There are some videos that are already posted that cover some things. But make sure you read over them, maybe jot down some notes, this kind of a thing. Look at the terms. Reading the chapter is probably not the most important thing, but the terms are going to be in the chapter. So if you're comfortable with your notes, that's fine. If you're comfortable with using what the chapter says, that's fine. But, you know, however you feel the best with preparing. Terms, articles, and the video links. And I've added a number of articles. Michelle, you raised some concerns. I think I've got a number of those added. There might be 1 or 2 more that I'll have to get to. But just looking at this, let's just start with the Chapter 3 terms, and then we'll go back and get into articles. Do y'all have any questions about any of the terms that are up here? Please. In the beginning, what was the relationship between the federal government and the state government in the beginning? Yeah, in the beginning of the country, and this is going back whether you want to look at the Articles of Confederation or whether you want to look at the Constitution as a whole at the beginning. In the beginning, the states had power and the federal government was significantly lower. And it was about this way for the first third of the country until the Civil War. After the Civil War was over, of course, the federal government kind of won the Civil War. If you really want to think about it, the power really leveled off for the middle third of the country. And now, in this back third of the country, it's the federal government that has the excessive amount of power and the state governments that are the lowest. So kind of keep that thought in mind. The state governments had more power in the beginning, and that's what we talked about at the very beginning of the federalism chapter. Up until the Civil War, yeah. Now, devolution, revolution is something that we talked about at the end of this. And does anybody know what devolution, revolution was? Yeah. Do you remember which president it was that was kind of specifically attributed with this? Anybody? It's slowing the growth of the government. So some people, and it was actually President Reagan. President Reagan was somebody who basically had said that government isn't the answer, but rather government is the problem. And Reagan said what we needed to do is we needed to cut back the growth of government. Matter of fact, not just cut back, we needed to cut government, period. Not cut the growth, but cut it, period. And he did a number of things to try and make government smaller. And the thought is that we needed to have a devolution revolution. So that in fact, some of the things that were done by the federal government should actually be done by the states because they could do it better for their own people. And I had mentioned to y'all in this context, did Reagan ever cut government? He slowed its growth, but he never cut it. Bill Clinton slowed its growth, but he never cut it. George W. and Barack, big government came back in a big way, as crazy as that sounds, and we're still kind of figuring out what Trump is doing. Go ahead.
Isn't big government kind of like socialism and communism?
You know, we could get into that, but since it's a review session, I don't want to give you a bunch of things that we're not going to be tested on, so let's hold that for another day. But have you got any questions about any of these other terms in Chapter 3? Go ahead. What did we talk about within the context of the tax and spend power? Because we just dealt with it. What was the issue?
Was that?
Wasn't that. No, it wasn't that. But that is an issue in one of these.
Is it you need to tax more and spend less?
We talked about that, but for the tax and spend power, what was the issue that we talked about? Because for each of these powers, tax and spend, commerce, full faith and credit, privileges and immunities, I said make sure you're comfortable with the power and the examples. Go ahead.
Was it like when the president's able to like cut out the line and tax or spending?
That's actually not a bad answer, but that's the line item veto. It wasn't this. Go ahead.
The one with the immigrants?
No, it wasn't the one with the immigrants. Oh,
But it wasn't about his cornfield?
Something about the cornfield?
Yeah, Jay's corn or something like that.
Oh, Jason.
What about alcohol?
Oh, Jay's nuts.
And the age that
drinking age. The tax and spend power, the issue for it was actually established in the drinking age. Now, could the federal government establish a national drinking age?
No.
No, they couldn't. Why? What's that? There's no power in the Constitution that says they could. So they used the tax and spend power and they tried to get creative. What did they do to kind of convince the states? Go ahead.
Like, we give like a 5% increase in something with the budget.
Well, what was it? A 5% increase in what money? You're right.
It was highway.
The highways, the roads, yeah. Basically what they did is they were concerned about drinking and driving. So the federal government said, we are going to kind of give, some people called it a bribe, some people said an incentive, but they said, we're going to give the states, if you will voluntarily raise your drinking age to 21, we will give you 5% extra in your highway funds. What was significant about this is that would mean that the state could take 5% of the money that they had allotted for their highways and then they could spend it in a different area that they really wanted to. Now, how did this play out? I mean, some states really liked it, some states really didn't. Anybody want to talk about either of those?
I recall you saying states that didn't want to cooperate, they would just stay the same, they wouldn't get the extra money.
They wouldn't get the extra money. Anything else?
It was eventually, it was constitutional.
Why did they say it was constitutional? Or why did the states say it wasn't constitutional?
Kind of like they were coercing and abusing.
Coercing. This is blackmail. This is extortion kind of a thing. Supreme Court took a look at this case, and basically the federal government's argument was, you know, it is our power to tax and spend, and I believe I had given y'all the example of the Newport Filter Kings. If somebody borrowed money in order to buy, and you told them, I'll loan you the money, you pay it back to me, but you can't use it to buy cigarettes, and then they did actually buy cigarettes, then you wouldn't really loan them money again because they didn't meet your condition. Well, the federal government basically said, look, we have the tax and spend power, and if you want this additional money, then you need to meet our requirement. And if you choose to meet it, so be it, you get the money. And if you don't choose to meet it, then you don't get the money, but it's your choice. The state said, oh no, this is blackmail, this is extortion, you know we can't turn down money, this is such a political issue. And they said this was the federal government kind of stepping into what traditionally had been a state function. The Supreme Court said, does anybody remember what the court said? Because they did say it was legal to do, because you still have this going on today. But does anybody remember why? They said this is an incentive. They said if you would have said you would get X amount of highway funds, minus 5% if you did not raise your drinking age, now that would be something that would be more like blackmail or extortion. But as it is, if you said no, you were going to be in the exact same place as you would have been. But what they said, going back on this, was this is just an incentive, and if you choose to take it, then you got to meet the condition. And if you choose not to, you're not in any worse position than you would have been, you know, had this offer not ever been made. So yeah, this was legal. And do you remember what power that I said they could have used to basically try and regulate the drinking age?
Commerce power?
Commerce power. Why?
Because alcohol is transferred over state lines.
Oh, there's something even more basic than that. I mentioned Louisiana, how I went to college in Louisiana, and I mentioned Texas, Mississippi, and Arkansas.
People would drive to Louisiana to get alcohol.
People would drive to alcohol. They would drive to Louisiana to get the alcohol, which actually meant that they were the ones that were engaged in interstate commerce. What other questions have you got from chapter 3?
Full faith and credit card.
What was full faith and credit?
Isn't that when like
That's what the
as a
licenses.
citizen you have actually
Never mind. Go ahead, Nathan.
Isn't that with the licenses?
Yeah, so what about the
So that
licenses?
if you have a license in Maryland and you move to New York, they have to accept any legal documentation.
Well, if you had a license in Maryland and you traveled in New York, they would accept the license. Yeah. If you moved there, then you'd have to get a New York license. But let me ask, so what's the general rule that you can get from this driver's license rule? Anybody?
To be more specific.
Yeah, to be more specific, what are we looking for?
Rule.
Yeah, go ahead, Haley.
I was going to say laws and policies that are like in one state are upheld in another state, so long as you have like documentation.
Yeah, you're really, really close on this. The trick is that if you've got a binding legal document in one state, like for example a driver's license, like for example a marriage license, like for example a criminal, outstanding criminal warrant, these kinds of things, then they would be recognized in other states. So you don't have to go get a new license if you're just passing through. Or if you move to a different state, you don't have to remarry. Or if they pull you over using full faith and credit and they find out that you've got an outstanding warrant, they're going to facilitate the process to extradite you. Do you remember what issue dealing with slavery fell under full faith and credit?
I know you talked
What
about
provision fell? Go ahead, Nahom.
Wait, are you talking like if you were a slave like in a state that's legal, then you go out of the state?
Yeah.
If-
Fugitive slave clause, exactly. If you escaped and you went to a free state, but somebody came to that free state with documentation that said that you were their property, then that would have actually been upheld too. So the full faith and credit clause was something that had good intentions maybe, but it also had some potentially dubious outcomes. That is no longer obviously part of full faith and credit, the fugitive slave clause, because slavery was ended with the 13th Amendment. What other questions have you got up here? Dual federalism, don't worry about that one. I won't ask you any questions about dual federalism. What else have you got? While you're thinking, just to make sure that everybody is clear on this, I have not given the ideology quiz yet, so do not worry about any terms dealing with ideology. Don't worry about liberal, conservative, any of that. We'll deal with that on the next exam. This is for both classes. What else have you got from chapter 3? Go ahead. Okay, give me something else if you got something else. Criminal searches. We talked about 1 or 2, I think.
That when police officer has that reasonable suspicion to search you, they can't just search you because you are of a certain ethnic background that they just want.
So what article is this talking about?
The Hispanics are illegal.
Arizona article. What was the law that Arizona passed?
papers.
They could stop people based
Go ahead, Jay. Zoom in on Jay. Go ahead.
They could stop people based on what they look like. So if they look like an immigrant, you
Could they just stop anybody, or was there kind of a guideline? Lawful contact. They could stop you, or they could actually ask for your papers during the context of a lawful contact. And if you remember, I had mentioned to you, if you got pulled over for speeding, well, that's a lawful contact. They could ask you for documentation. If you called in an emergency, once they kind of stabilized the emergency, they could ask you for your papers. If, in fact, you helped apprehend someone, once they got this person locked up and off to the icebox, so to speak, then, in fact, they could ask you for your papers, because all of these were lawful contacts. If they just stopped you and asked for papers, that's not supposed to be allowed. What else did that law deal with? It wasn't just about papers, but there were 3 other things. The illegal transport, the illegal housing, and the illegal employment of people that were undocumented in the country. If you remember, go ahead.
Which one is that again?
This is the Arizona law, and it's dealing with criminal searches. If you think about it, they're basically asking you for papers, but there were these other pieces to it. And again, it was legal under the context of a lawful contact. Go ahead.
I think the border thing where you can't house them, give them, you can't help them in a way.
Yeah.
You can't. It's you can't house them in your house. It's you're breaking the law.
That's what the law said: housing, transportation, and employment. Why did Arizona pass this?
Because the federal government wasn't going to pass it.
Arizona basically said, federal government, you have failed us. We need to protect Arizonans, and their argument was that they had almost 500,000 people that were undocumented there, and this was costing hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer dollars, so we've got to protect our Arizonans, if you'll recall on this. Federal government termed this as what?
Unconstitutional.
Why?
It was discrimination.
Discrimination, racial profiling, this kind of a piece. And in 21st century America, the argument was this should not be going on. They even referred to this as, they compared it to another society in history, Nazi Germany, with the calls for papers, please. And you got upset about this when we talked about it that day, as I recall. Going back on this, what did the Supreme Court hold?
That they may uphold
All four parts?